and you no longer have Pollard, then you're in a tough spot. Unless you're in a waiver wire spot where you're first pick and you can pick him up immediately, something like that. So if I can, I'm holding on to him. And if you happen to have Pollard and you don't have Zeke, before you drop him, which some people have probably already done, you might want to maybe make an offer to the Zeke owner, and see if you can maybe get something for him. I know it's kind of late for that, but long story short, I'm holding on to Pollard as long as I can, especially with my roster so heavily invested in Zeke.
Yeah, you might as well. I mean, what do you have to lose? I mean, it's not really much of a sunk cost at this point, but hey, if you can squeeze any type of juice out of, maybe you, maybe the guy that had, Dame that we were just talking about, maybe he had, Carlos Hyde, and hey, maybe you have Pollard, and maybe you also own Duke Johnson. Well, hey, why don't you try to flip Pollard for Carlos Hyde or something like that? And then,
Absolutely.
you could do something that would benefit you in some way, shape, or form. So, all right. Well, moving on to the wide receiver position, that any guys that you think are going to be kind of some fringe starts that we should really consider plugging into our starting lineups. One decision I'm trying to make this week, for example, is I'm trying to figure out if I should plug in Curtis Samuel in the flex. I know you're high on Cam this week. How much do you think that's going to benefit the receivers? And how much do you think that that we could see a big game from either DJ Moore or Curtis Samuel this week?
Yeah, I actually like both of those guys. I think from a season-long standpoint, they both have a lot of upside. There's no Devin Funchess there. I think Cam's shoulder injury is a thing of the past. I expect him to be more accurate and to get the ball to these guys in open field. They're both young, talented guys with a lot of potential. I live in the Charlotte area, so I hear a lot of the hype around these guys, and they look really good. I think from a daily standpoint, I think Samuel is much cheaper than Moore, so I think he'll be a much more popular guy in terms of cash games, which I think makes DJ Moore an excellent pivot in GPPs. But I expect both of these guys to do well in a Carolina offense that I expect to be pretty sneaky. I think they're going to be pretty potent this season, and you want to get in on the ground floor with these guys.
Yeah, and definitely a big price discrepancy, especially over on DraftKings. We have a $1,700 difference. So love that strategy as far as, perhaps paying up to be contrarian there. But yeah, definitely like that call. And I think the possibility there is definitely available for Cam to produce a big game with this high point total expected. One guy that I definitely have had an eye on in the same price range as Samuel has been Michael Gallup. He's only 4,300 on DraftKings. And with some of the things that we were just talking about, where Zeke is going to get 20 to 25 reps, I don't know if that means touches, or I don't know if that just means like snaps. We know that Todd Gurley is not on a pitch count. So it sounds like that Rams-Panthers game is definitely going to be kind of high octane as we expect. With the Dallas-New York game, maybe not quite as much, but I definitely see the potential where Michael Gallup could actually end up having a really good game at that same price point as Curtis Samuel. Definitely think that he's a guy that you could plug in and has some very high upside. We saw how many times that he was just missed last year on some of those long balls from Dak. And who knows, maybe we kick off the season for the Cowboys with one of those actually connecting this time. So we'll see if that plays out. One situation I want to also ask you about, Thad, was in Houston. Now, this game's not going to be on the main slate in DFS, but from a start-sit perspective, we know it sounds like Kiki QT is not going to play. Um, do you have any sort of trust in, any deeper leagues for Kenny Stills to get any sort of significant target volume in week one coming into that offense here? He's only been there about a week now as you and I record this. But, in a game that appears to be a fantasy bonanza in New Orleans, one that I'm really looking forward to. Are you willing to play him in some of these leagues where we have multiple flex positions, or maybe the deeper 16 team leagues and such?
I am. I think he certainly took a bump in value leaving Miami. I think we say's success that there is room for three wideouts in Houston, and he's a talented young guy. I think the opportunity is there, and I think Deshaun Watson is a guy that can get him the ball. I think this is certainly a situation where if he does well from a daily standpoint and from a season-long standpoint, this is probably the lowest ownership you're going to see him at and the lowest salary, just because it's going to skyrocket. But on a team where their running game certainly took a big hit, I think he certainly has a lot of upside. So I do like him this week.
Yeah, there's quite a few guys that you can choose from now. If you are playing DFS, there's a ton of options being taken away because of the Monday night doubleheader, because of the Sunday night game, etc. But yeah, a lot of decisions to still be made here. Dad, I wanted to ask you about one in particular and kind of your thoughts on the Cleveland situation and the Minnesota receiving situation, because in Cleveland, we have the situation where Odell has consistently been kind of a target hog, if you will, in the games that he's been healthy and played with the Giants in the past. And of course, he gets a major QB upgrade with Baker Mayfield, which is fantastic. But of course, he's also nursing a hip injury. You got to start OBJ if he's on your team in season long. But my question revolving around Cleveland is, how much do you trust some of these other passing targets, like, for instance, Jarvis Landry, David Njoku, and even maybe, Hollywood Higgins, if you are looking at some of these guys? What are your thoughts on kind of some of these targets in Cleveland? Do you still think it's going to be just the Odell show? And then over in Minnesota, my second question there is, what are you thinking about, this being an Adam Thielen week? We've seen Stephon Diggs now showing up on the injury report again, and that's tended to show that he's going to have kind of a subpar game, and that maybe Adam Thielen is the one to target this week. What are your thoughts on those two situations in Cleveland and Minnesota?
Well, as far as Cleveland goes, I think anywhere that Odell Beckham Jr. is, it's the Odell Beckham Jr. show. That's bottom line. I was a little surprised when he said that he was having some lingering hip issues. He was dealing with a hip pointer, which should be 100% by now. I don't think he has an injury designation as it stands, so I expect him to play and play well. I think wide receiver is going to make or break your lineups in daily this week, and I think if I'm paying up, he's the guy that I'm paying up for. I think Rashard Higgins is a sneaky play. That's my second favorite receiver on Cleveland. I think he's already shown that he has some rapport with Baker Mayfield, and he's good. So I think if this offense is as potent as people expect it to be, it won't just be a trio of Baker Mayfield, Nick Chubb, and Odell Beckham. I think Rashard Higgins is going to get his share as well. So I like him as a sneaky play. As far as Minnesota goes, initially I wasn't really sure how to feel about Diggs' injury, but it looks like it's the real deal. It's got that questionable tag. So he's a guy who doesn't or at least based on his history, he doesn't play well injured. And I'm sure most people would think that that's normal, but some guys do, some guys don't, and he does not. I think that certainly bumps up Adam Thielen, who I was already high on, but I really, really like him a lot, especially in tournaments, in daily, because I think Dalvin Cook is going to be a very heavily owned commodity. So I think as a leverage play off of the Cook ownership, throwing Adam Thielen in your lineup, because he could easily, get 12 catches for over 120 yards and a touchdown. I mean, the guy's done it multiple times week in and week out. So really, really high on Thielen this weekend.
Oh yeah, for sure. And we saw how he just started off last year as a monster. I mean, he was catching everything. And I feel like that's the way that this season is going to start as well. And yeah, it's different, at least with Diggs, like you mentioned, that might sound obvious, but yeah, some of these guys that we draft for our fantasy teams, I mean, they can be questionable every week. Like Julio Jones comes to mind. It seems like he's questionable for 10 weeks out of the, 14, 15 where it matters. But yet the dude still goes out and he produces and he puts up, at least his average fantasy performance. Whereas Diggs is just drastically underwhelming every time has any sort of injury designation, going back even to the days of when we had the probable tag. So, things like that definitely kind of play into, my decision making, and definitely some things to think about here going forward as well when we are building those lineups this week. Now, whether we're talking DFS or season long, I really like where the episode's going. Last year, we tended to spend a little too long on quarterback, and I really liked getting into the wide receiver talk because, like you said, it tends to be the make or break spot. From a daily fantasy aspect, a lot of times we're going out, especially as the season progresses and injuries start to mount up and, rosters get depleted. We always kind of chase those injury fill-in running backs, and those guys are always popular, whether you are playing in tournaments, or if you're playing in cash games. And of course, they're the essential waiver wire guys that everyone's trying to grab every week when those starting running backs go down. So the wide receiver, I feel like, is the most important position in fantasy, whether you're playing in, PPR or standard leagues. We need those guys that are grabbing the catches. We need those guys that are scoring touchdowns. Thad, anybody that you think might not have a great week or not catch too many balls or touchdowns this week?
I think the one guy that I'm trying to stay off of him. It's hard to stay off of Julio Jones just because he finished last season in such a strong fashion, but he's got a tough matchup this weekend and going up against Minnesota. And when Minnesota's running right, their opponents, especially in Minnesota, don't play so well. They don't give up a lot of fantasy points to quarterbacks, and he's got a tough matchup against Xavier Rhodes, so who held him in check the last couple of times they played together. He's expensive from a daily fantasy standpoint, and I can pay that extra, $100 or $2 and get Odell Beckham, or maybe pay down a little bit for a guy like Keenan Allen, who I love this weekend. So Julio is a guy that if I miss out on a big Julio Jones week, then I'll just have to wait until the next time.
No, that makes sense, man. And one guy kind of piggybacking off of your Kyler Murray take or fade rather in the QB section is Larry Fitzgerald, a guy that basically has been drafted in every league, but a guy that not a lot of people are talking about. And, for good reason. I mean, he's been around so long. It's almost like we take Fitz for granted, but honestly, I don't see this Cardinals offense putting up a ton of points here. Whether you believe in the air raid or not, I think the matchup it's going to be pretty tough with that Lions front against that shaky offensive line that we mentioned. And who knows, maybe Fitz acts as the safety blanket for Murray, and who knows, he could have 10 catches for like 66 yards, but, getting all those short A dot grabs over the middle and, being that comforting binky to Kyler Murray, the young buck. But that's one guy I'm definitely going to avoid this particular week. I also don't